but we're not uniformly distributed across all university disciplines. We're sort of concentrated in certain disciplines. If I was interested in finding a creationist at a university, the first place I would go is the mathematics department. When I worked at the Department of Defense, I knew hundreds of different mathematicians, and of all those mathematicians that I ever met, I can only remember meeting a handful, maybe 5 or 6, that I would describe as being hardcore evolutionists. But many, many, many dozens of those mathematicians you could easily describe as being creationists. If observation, and then I'm going to ask you a question. My observation is this. In order for all living organisms to be related to each other, it is necessary that organisms change. Now, that first part there, all living organisms to be related to each other, that's evolution. That's what evolutionists claim, that's what evolution is the belief that all living things are related to each other. And this statement that I have up here is undeniable. Everybody knows this is true. In order for all living organisms to be related to each other, it is necessary that organisms change. So here's my question. Is the fact that organisms change sufficient to conclude that all living things are related to each other? Well, the answer is no. And I can prove that, and I'm going to prove that. But before I do, I want to demonstrate to you that many evolutionists, maybe most evolutionists, believe that the answer to this question is yes. Right? First example, Niles Eldredge. Niles Eldredge wrote a book called The Triumph of Evolution. This guy's if you've not heard of him, he's a very, very famous evolutionist. He wrote a book called The Triumph of Evolution. In that book, he said this. Modern creationists readily accept small-scale evolutionary change and the origin of new species from old. That, to my mind, is tantamount to conceding the entire issue, where there's utter continuity in evolutionary processes from the smallest scales up through the largest scales. If Niles Eldredge were here right now, and he heard me say, of course it is true that things change, he would say, aha, you believe in evolution. Another example is Richard Dawkins. Here, he's certainly familiar with that name. He wrote a book called The God Delusion. And in that book, he said he's referring to me, the creationist, doesn't understand the power of accumulation. You see, I'm Richard Dawkins now. Things change, and those changes accumulate, and that's evolution. There you go. That's Richard Dawkins. Now, one more example. This was given by a biologist who came to from my school, who gave a talk on evolution, and essentially made the same argument that Richard Dawkins just made. If organisms are changing now, they must have done so in the past as well. Small changes accumulate to large ones easily over long periods of time. We definitely had enough time. This is the basis of evolution. I would agree that this is the basis of evolution, but here's the issue right here. Small changes accumulate. See the word accumulation? That's the same word basically that Richard Dawkins used. Changes accumulate. End of discussion. Well, not the end of discussion. Let me show you why. First of all, let's quickly look at these examples. Number one, the bacteria, well, they're still bacteria. Number two, the mosquitoes, they're still mosquitoes. The moths are still moths. The finches are still finches. The fruit flies are still fruit flies. The changes that you're looking at here are absolutely insignificant changes. They're not big changes at all. There's no great big change where something is being dramatically changed from one thing into another thing. Now, why doesn't the fact that it just changes, don't they just accumulate and therefore evolution is automatically true, almost by default? No, and here's why. Look at example number 4, the finch bees. In the 1970s, Peter and Rosemary Grant were biologists at Princeton University, and they began to travel every summer to the Galapagos Islands. And as good scientists, they were good scientists, they began to study lots of different animals that were on the island, and one of the animals that they studied were the finches. They captured lots of these finches, they measured lots of things about these finches, and then I assume they didn't barbecue them, I assume they released the finches. But what they did is, because Peter Grant was a very good scientist, he noticed something that I find extraordinary, absolutely stunning. He noticed that there was a relationship between the average finch beak size and the amount of precipitation that occurred during the year. That's astonishing. It turns out that in the dry years, the average finch beak is higher, bigger, and then in the wet years, the average finch beak size was lower. Now, he thought about this for a little bit, and Peter Grant thought, I think this is an example of natural selection. And this was his reason. He said, in the wet years, there's lots and lots of seeds in the trees. There's lots of seeds for all the different birds that are out there, and so most of the birds are going to survive through that season. But in the dry years, when there's a drought, there are not as many seeds that are produced. Eventually, all the small seeds are gone. They're all eaten up. And when that happens, then the finches that have a bigger beak, they have an advantage over the finches that have a small beak. So that was his explanation. He said this is natural selection. He wrote this up in an article, and it got published in a journal. It got picked up by textbook publishers, and now you can go into a textbook tell you why it's not evolution in action. Peter Grant wrote this: the population subject to natural selection is oscillating back and forth. Right? If you look at that curve very carefully, what's it doing? It's going up and down and up and down and up and down and up and down. You guys have all studied trigonometry at some point in time, right? Right? When you study trigonometry, remember the graph of the sine wave? Right? Sine wave. Okay. Right? What is that called? That's called oscillation. Very good. Okay? And it's a very, very important model for biology. Why? Because in biology, things oscillate. If you think about it for a second, oscillation is almost literally the opposite of accumulation. See, there's no accumulation. There's lots of change going on here, but there's no accumulation. Is it doing this? Or this? No, it's doing this. What's it mean? It means there's lots of change occurring, but what's most of the change doing? It's canceling itself out. That's called oscillation. That's a big deal. Did you ever watch a nature program? You're 5 minutes into the nature program, and what are they talking about? They're talking about the cycles of nature. Right? You never seen the nature program. They don't talk about the cycles of nature. What is that referring to? The fact that in nature, changes oscillate. It is absolutely the most common change that we see in nature. So what we see here is that changes don't have to accumulate. Therefore, is the fact that organisms change sufficient to conclude that all living things are related to each other? The answer is clearly no. Now, at the end of this talk, I'm going to give you my email address. And if you want to send me an email, that will be fine. I'll be happy to write back and forth with you as long as you like about almost whatever you want to write about. But after one of my talks, I had a student who sent me this in an email. They said, face it, evolution occurred and it will occur. And I responded by saying, minor variation does occur. It is illogical to insist that because a bacteria can develop a resistance to an antibiotic that it can evolve into a whale. I would be interested in hearing your thoughts on this. I never heard back from them. And I've never, ever had a biology professor or anybody try to explain to me why I should logically conclude this. So if you don't have to logically conclude this, which there's no way you have to logically conclude this, then that argument is not a logical argument. All right, let me give you another example, a second example of necessary versus sufficient. The second law of thermodynamics. Lord Kelvin said there is no natural process, the only result of which is to cool and heat reserve and do external work. We don't say it like that today. We say it a lot simpler. We say it this way. Order tends to decrease. Or sometimes we say disorder tends to increase. This is a universal law of physics, that things are breaking down, that things are becoming less complex, they're breaking down. Now on the surface, think about that. Isn't that sort of contrary to evolution? On the surface, at least. I mean, this says things are getting less complicated, things are breaking down, disorder is increasing. If you believe in evolution, whether you want to admit it or not, you have to say that you believe that living things today are more complicated than they were in the past. Therefore, maybe it's not directed, but you would have to say that things are getting more complicated. That seems to be a violation of the second law of thermodynamics. Now, if you're a well-educated evolutionist, you already know the response that you're supposed to give whenever a creationist says, second law of thermodynamics. So does anybody want to give me what the answer is? What is it? Only closest. There you go. Very good. Okay, I was going to say it's a two-word answer. He's exactly right. The answer is open system. The answer is open system. They've been taught very well. This is what you're supposed to say. Now, I want to show you what that means. This is from an evolution textbook. The second law of thermodynamics applies only to closed systems, one in which no energy enters or leaves, while Earth and its organisms are open systems with radiant energy from the sun continually entering Earth's living system through photosynthesis. Right? So there you have it. I think they would agree that if the Earth was just kind of floating in space all by itself, then there's no way that evolution could occur. But because we are in a solar system and we have all this energy coming into the Earth from the sun, well, that's a different story completely. I mean, that's what they mean when they say open system. Now, I'm going to make an observation, and then I'm going to ask you a question. Here's my observation. In order for complexity to increase, energy is necessary. That's a fact. Nobody disagrees with that. But I have a question for you. Is energy sufficient to increase complexity? Well, it's not. Let me demonstrate that. What you're looking at here is, this is a picture of Mercury. This is a picture of Venus. And Mercury and Venus without any intelligence at all. You can't do that, right? If you know anything about mathematical modeling, the very first thing you have to do is your model has to fit the situation that you're trying to model. And this one clearly does not. So right from the start, they had a problem. My absolute favorite argument against evolution is DNA. Absolutely positively my favorite argument. And the reason is that I'm a code expert. That was my job at the Department of Defense. I am a code expert. And I know for a fact that there has never been a code that was not created by an intelligent being, ever. And so when I talk to people about this, and I say, can you give me an example of a code that was created by an unintelligent being, by an unintelligent process or a process that did not involve intelligence? People will point to this. They don't have any choice. They have to point to this because they have to believe that everything came about by evolution. This is the most complicated code in the universe. The most complicated code in the universe is the one example you want to give me of a code that was created by a non-intelligent process. I'm just having a really hard time understanding that. Now, I would argue that understanding of DNA is one of the most fundamental things you need to know to say that you're an educated person in biology today. I would argue that. I have a biology textbook at home. It's about 1,000 pages. It's a very good textbook. If you look at the back and you count the pages, DNA is mentioned on somewhere between 200 and 250 pages in the textbook. I mean, every time you turn around, DNA, right? Okay, now, if DNA is this important, and it is, then they must have, what do you think? 10 pages of this textbook just dedicated to the evolutionary origin of DNA, right? Well, you might think that. I'm going to read for you the entire description of the evolutionary origin of the most complicated code in the universe from this textbook. Paragraph number 1. DNA's simple and elegant structure seems to be the work of an accomplished sculptor. I'll buy that. It looks like it was designed. Paragraph 2. Just how nature arrived at this molecule and its sister molecule RNA remains one of the greatest and potentially unsolvable scientific mysteries. We don't know where it came from. And in fact, we're even to admit we may never know where it came from. Paragraph 3. Yet the graceful cinemas profile of the DNA double helix is the result of random chemical reactions in a simmering primordial stew. Really? Really? I think that's a non sequitur. And if you want to prove that, I'm willing to listen to you. But don't tell me your opinion, because that's all that is. And that's in a biology textbook. And that is the entire description of the evolutionary origin of DNA. It's in the textbook. Okay, now, it came to my attention a few years ago that there is a college locally here that is teaching an evolution lab. This concept fascinated me. And I wanted to know what exactly you can teach in an evolution lab. So eventually I got my hands on a copy of the evolution lab. The first thing the students do when they go into the lab is they measure how tall everybody is. And they have them make a histogram. Over here you got the number of students, over here you got the different heights, right? This clearly demonstrates that there is variability in the human population according to a characteristic known as height. But I think before anybody ever even went into that lab, we already knew that people were different heights. What does this teach us about evolution? Well, nothing. When the students have finished this demonstration, what do they know about the evolution of humans that they didn't know before they did this demonstration? Nothing. Right, what's the second thing they did? The second thing they did is they were given a handful of sunflower seeds, and they were asked to count the number of stripes on the sunflower seeds. And make a histogram. And again, I'm a mathematician. I like when students make histograms. I think that's a good thing to be able to do. Over here, number of sunflower seeds, number of stripes. And I got to tell you, I'm maybe not the most observant person in the world. I didn't know that there were different number of stripes on sunflower seeds. So I learned something. But now that I understand that there are a different number of stripes on sunflower seeds, how does that help me understand the evolution of the sunflower? How does that help me understand the evolution of the sunflower seeds? That doesn't help me at all. What does this have to do with evolution? It doesn't have anything to do with evolution. Okay? Now, they actually did 2 more exercises involving picking marbles out of jars. Absolutely true. And when they were done, all of the different exercises, this was the final slide in the lab. This is the evolutionary tree of life. years ago, I was studying the origin of life. I wanted to know everything I could find out about this and the research that was being done. And I wanted to go back as far as I could, back to some of the early stuff that the Russians were doing back in the 20s, Yuri Miller, the 50s, and the stuff that came on after that. And as I was doing this research, I came across an article written by George Wall in Scientific America, and it was The Origin of Life, August 1954. Now, you might go, 60, almost 70 years ago. I mean, give us something a little bit more current. Well, the quote here is not current, but the idea found in the quote, absolutely spot on current for right now. Right? Here's what George Wall said. Time is, in fact, the hero of the plot. Given so much time, the impossible becomes possible, the possible becomes probable, and the probable virtually certain. One has only to wait. Time itself performs the miracle. Now, he was specifically talking about the origin of life, but this is not just talking about the origin of life. This is an argument that is currently constantly being used when I talk to biology professors about evolution. I was talking to a guy a year ago, and I went through a list of things that he could not do, he could not explain to me. And he very patiently sat there, yeah, you're right, that's true. And I paused for a breath, and he snuck in, give me 1 million years. That was his response. Now, I'm not God, and I can't give you a second. And I can't give him any time either. But what was he saying? Think about what he was saying. He said, yeah, I can't do any of those things. But, given enough time, the impossible becomes possible, the possible becomes probable, the probable virtually certain. Right? Look at this. Time is performing the miracle. Right? That's very old, this comment, but the idea is not old. It's still going on right now. Now, there is a non sequitur here. Do you see where it is? It's not here at the end. The probable, if given enough time, the probable becomes virtually certain. That is mathematically true. If something is likely to happen, given enough time, it will happen. And if you go back a line, the possible becomes probable. That is absolutely mathematically true as well. If something might happen, given enough time, it will happen. You know, if you bet the lottery in Illinois long enough, you will win the lottery. If you live about 2 million years and you bet every year, every week for several, for 2 million years, you will win the. You're not likely to live 2 million years, but right? If there was enough time involved, there's a very small probability, and with enough time, that possible becomes probable. So where's the non sequitur? It's right there. The impossible becomes possible? I don't think that person knows what the word impossible means. Listen, if possible means the probability is zero. If the probability is zero, the probability is zero. It doesn't become 0.1 because we waited a long time. Right? The impossible is possible. That's a non sequitur. Okay, how are we doing? Okay, I want to talk very quickly about some of the inflated claims. Listen, if you have to inflate your claims for every argument you make, I think there's a problem with some of your arguments. Just me personally. Let me show you some examples of some inflated claims. I've shown you this picture already, but there's something about this picture that I didn't say looking at here, 1/60th of an inch. This is a really good example of evolution in action. What would most students' reaction to that be? You've got to be kidding me, right? It wouldn't be so impressive of a claim anymore. That's an example of an inflated claim. DNA. I said DNA is my favorite, so I'm coming back to DNA. Here's a slide taken at the field visit. Again, it's very poor quality, right? It looks like you're doing an eye test at the Now, I'm going to blow up just one piece of it right at the bottom there. Do you see that? It says on the slide here that 95% of your DNA is the same as the chips. Have you heard that? All right. Now, I can tell you a story. When I was in school, I know, a long time ago, right? 1970s, I took biology in high school, and then in the late 70s, I took it in college. When I was in school, they told us that our DNA was 99% the same as a chip's. 99%. I believe that incorrect figure was responsible for convincing more people in my generation that evolution was true than anything else. It wasn't true. Okay? But where did they get the 99% figure? It actually comes from a scientific experiment that does not directly compare the DNA of chimps and humans. See? It didn't actually now, what they did, it doesn't actually matter what they did, okay? Like, if you want to talk about it later, you can ask me, I'll tell you what they did. But it was not a direct comparison of the DNA of chimps and humans. In fact, we didn't finish the Human Genome Project until 2001. The Chimp Genome Project was completed, I think, a few years after that. It wasn't until a good portion of the way through that project that they actually had enough DNA of chimps and humans that they could actually directly compare them. As you go through the 80s, this figure, which was 99%, it began to fall. It became 98%. By 2003, it had settled at 95%. And this is what I hear reported most of the time right now. That your DNA and a chimp DNA are 95% the same. I got news for you. Your DNA and chimp DNA are not 95% the same. They are absolutely not 95% the same. Now, how do I know that? Well, it turns out that it is very, very complicated to actually compare the two DNAs. You see, you don't just pick up the two streams of DNA and go, how close are they? Right? You can't do that. There's lots and lots of base pairs that you have to be compared. And then, because evolutionists believe that there's been lots of insertions and lots of deletions, you have to pull pieces out, put pieces in, and move things up and down. And clearly this is not being done by hand. Can you understand that? So therefore, it's being done on a computer. On a computer program that somebody wrote. Now, if you ask 4 people to write a computer program to compare the same 2 identical strips of DNA, they would come up with 4 different answers to how similar they are. Because what? Because they would make different assumptions as they were writing this computer code. It would be based upon the assumptions that they personally were using. Now, this is the number that they have kind of settled on at this point. It is way too high. Right? How come I can say that so definitively? Because what this actually is, what they've actually compared, they've gone into the DNA, they've taken strips of the DNA that they know are similar to each other, and then those are the pieces that they've compared. So what this really says is, when we compared similar strips of DNA, this is how similar they were. They were 95% the same. That's not equivalent to saying that the DNA is 95% the same. They're not even looking at the pieces that are dissimilar. They're not. See, since this is being done by computer, the number you come up with depends upon who's doing the counting and how you're doing the counting and what it is you're counting. Now, the last time I read a paper on this, the actual number of base pairs that were actually compared in the chimps and humans was about Springfield, who is a PhD biologist. He works for the state. And after one of my talks, he wrote a review, and I mentioned this, and he wrote in his review, I'm not sure always how to explain exactly how an evolutionary background would help, but it is relevant. Now, if you have a PhD in biology, and you can't tell me how a background of evolution helps you understand things, then I would argue that it's not helpful at all. So my answer to this is nothing. Okay? This times I've read something that